Okay, so then good afternoon to everyone, and to myself, good evening. I'm actually in the field at the moment. I'm in the Philippines, so doing my research at the moment on one of my projects on another species. But for today, we'll talk about something about the giant honeybees, which also helped me reach my only claim to fame, which was getting one of the six Planet Earth Awards last year by the Alliance of World Scientists. So I wanted to share with you how the different sciences that was used into this project actually is able to link both the academia as well as indigenous and local knowledge. So bear with me for a while because I'm gonna first ask all of you, what is a giant honeybee? So perhaps most of you are familiar with the term honeybee, but this is probably mostly with the European honeybee or the Apis mellifera, which is so far the one that can be found in Europe. And this is quite a controversial insect because, as you know, there are quite a number of things happening to the bees, not just in terms of their decimation based on so much use of insecticides, but also there are other issues related, as we will see later, to climate change with their survival. And so the giant honeybee that I will talk about is another species, which is Apis dorsata. And this can only be found in Southeast Asia and South Asia. And as you can see, it's open nesting, meaning that it's something that doesn't really like being domesticated into boxes. So one cannot put it into frames. So they just really like to stick on the branches of trees. And actually, most honeybee species are wild, and meaning that they cannot be domesticated, and that there is no hermit honeybee. So when we talk about honey, and because they have a highly social behavior, so similar to us, humans who are very social, and that makes them distinct from other bees. Now, in the Philippines, specifically on the island of Palawan, I'm not sure if any of you have been there or have also heard about it. It's one of the UNESCO designated areas, biosphere reserves. So indigenous peoples there, they're called Tagbanwa. They traditionally hunt giant honeybees and then they gather the hive products. So you can see here a reference, as this is already quite early in within the documented history on of the Philippines, that in 1907 already someone documented that, oh, the principal occupation of the Tagbanwa or the indigenous Tagbanwa is to bring from the mountains almasiga, bees, and wax. So, and you can see on the photo here that this is an indigenous elder who is cutting the honeycombs, and the white that's the honeycomb, and then the white parts are actually the baby bees or the brood. And I would say it's acquired taste. If you try to eat it, I think when I ate it, it was quite milky. So that was the taste. But traditionally, they also eat the giant honeybees or the honeycomb with the baby bees. And of course, that's the one that we can eat, because otherwise, if it's a little bit older, then we can eat the sting. Um, and so the project is actually an action research partnership. And it's more of coming from a transdisciplinary approach, because in 2012, I was doing field work for creating financial mechanisms for community forestry and smallholder agriculture on Palawan Biosphere Reserve. And during that time, even if I was discussing other issues with the indigenous community members, some other things came up, such as the one on honey. So then that field work gave me data on the honey enterprise, but as well as anecdotes from talking with indigenous peoples there during my homestay. And one of the anecdotes that came about was that they were mentioning, you know what, we don't get enough honey flow. And for them, honey is similar to its color. It's like gold. Because when there's the honey flow during summer, it means that they would have some money. And because honey demands quite a higher amount than other commodities or other fruits or vegetables that they can sell. And therefore, the research problem was informed by these two things, which is gathering data, more of the technical gathering of data, but as well as participant observation, but not just observation, but really immersing with the community and from staying with them. And this is an example of the product that they sell. So once they gather the honey, it's turned into this product that can be sold in the market. And the action research tried to address key social ecological issues because, as we can see, the gathering of honey is a social ecological practice. So it entails the indigenous honey hunter cooperating with the giant honeybees. So that's a totally different issue because I joined them and it was actually very difficult. And there are no trails in the mountains, so one really needs to just go and then also have to extend your neck all the time to look up trees and then try to see if there are any hives. And then once we see a hive, then we sort of like mark all of this, and then later on, in the afternoon, we will go to each tree and then just take the hives. And so it's a very difficult job, I would say. And so, based on the study by Shackleton et al. In 2011, it's very interesting to work on social ecological issues, especially on species that are under threat, and they have critical local use and they are non-domesticated or wild. And this is something that we try to do in the project, or I try to do in the project. So the giant honeybee and the forest. So there's the natural resource used by the forest peoples for livelihoods. Initially, as you know, it was subsistence. It was an indigenous practice that eventually turned into a livelihood opportunity. So as they became more integrated into the market economy, and also there is a need of maintaining natural and cultural capital in indigenous community forests. So the maintenance is that, if you remember, Dr. Bello was mentioning earlier about my affiliation with an NGO called Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program. Their idea was that in order to conserve trees, let's find other ways to have livelihoods apart from selling timber or cutting timber. So in that part of the Philippines, in Palawan, it's also called the last frontier. So where most of the country's primary forests can be found. Other parts of the Philippines, very difficult to find this any more forests or any more primary forests. And therefore it's very rich, also like inviting a lot of poachers, inviting a lot of illegal timber people. So then sometimes what happens is that it's mostly forest degradation wherein an external person would approach indigenous peoples and ask them, okay, could you please cut one, two, three, four, five, just around this very, let's say, like small number of timber for them. But And I heard from them actually that during the pandemic, this was it actually increased. So we were thinking like, oh, probably there was a better conservation because people couldn't really move, but actually according to the indigenous communities, forest degradation was more during the time of the pandemic because there was no wildlife, no enforcers, etc. around. Anyway, so that's why the NTFP, the non-timber forest product, is quite important in terms of forest conservation. And last but not the least, it's not just conservation, but also the development of forest communities because they, as already mentioned earlier, being coming from an indigenous practice and then eventually having to integrate in the market economy without being exposed to what are the pros and cons of the market economy, etc., then in a way the development needs to be really addressed as well and not just conservation. So we actually had mutual learning. And so what happened was, you can see here they're holding some cameras, but they're also holding here a GPS equipment. So these were used in monitoring and also in a methodology called photo voice. So the GPS was used for monitoring the beehives, and while the camera was used for the photo voice methodology. So mostly monitoring where the bees were, and then the photos were essentially capturing anything that was we just left it, or I just left it with the community members, and they used it for supposedly for anything related to the honeybee. But then that's the beauty of leaving it with them, because they essentially capture everything, anything that is important to them. And so they were taught how to use this, and also the equipment were left with them. And their feedback is that the GPS training was important for them to know where the nesting trees are. So the nesting trees are the trees where we will find the giant honeybees. And this has also been one of the issues that came up in relation to climate change. So as you know, climate change can also shift the so-called phenology, or when the trees flower, for example, and the flower is very important for the bees because that's where they get the nectar and the pollen from. And sometimes because of the difference, or the trees get confused about the temperature, then they don't have flowers. And then now also then some of the bees, supposedly they know that, oh, it's this time the tree should be already flowering, but it's not, so they get then hungry. So that's one of the issues that came up. And then also they also mentioned, for in terms of the camera training, it is important to show proof to the government that these areas are sacred for our culture and livelihood. So these are what the pictures that they captured tried to show us. And this is an example of the mapping of the giant honeybee nest. So these are the different dots, different colored dots. So you can see nests, and which are the orange dots. But there are the blue ones are the households. But interesting for us is that this one, which is the pink dot, which is rather far away and very close already to the water. And we were thinking that by looking at this map, we see that the bees travel quite far, and that the whole landscape must be taken care of. And so we also did look at the content of the honey, And interestingly, this is what it came out. So very nice photos of the different pollen, which can identify different species of trees, flowers that the honeybees went to. And so we say here that even the honey itself can be a record of the forest's floral biodiversity because of the pollen content. But as I mentioned earlier, very near the coast, this was a surprise that the Rhizoparaceae is a mangrove family. And therefore, you can see like, oh, all of these specimens were taken from the deep forest, but when looking into the content of the honey, there's the mangroves that can be found. So how come? And so there is also like s- some analysis on the vegetation cover. And sadly, then from 1988 to 2015, there is still a decrease of vegetation cover using the normalized difference vegetation index analysis. And this somewhat um, calls into question how effective really is non-timber forest product approach, or maybe other way around, we can say that maybe it could have been worse, right, if there was no intervention from the NTFP approach. But this is one of the things that we need to look at, because everything is connected when we look at the social ecological system of the giant honeybee gathering. And so part of this is to asking how to give back also to the community. And this is sort of my North Star from my 2012 field work, wherein I was with another Indigenous community. And like the elder asked me, so this was for my master's, you'll get your degree by studying us, but what's in it for us? And it was um, a sobering question, very difficult question, because I couldn't answer. I mean, the only thing I could answer was like, "Oh, I'm going to give you a copy of my thesis," but really, how useful is that, right? And so since then, it's something that's been on every project that I do. I This is always something that I keep in mind. It's a question that I need to have answered before I implement any project. And so based on one training that I got from the Yale University Environmental Leadership and Training Initiative. So I pitched the idea of forest restoration to the community. And because, as I mentioned earlier, we were already thinking about the problem of the honey flow in relation to the different nesting trees and also different trees where or plants that they get the pollen and nectar from. And then when they said yes, I searched for funding opportunities and applied. And so I got some money from the Hand in Hand funds of Rapunzel. I don't know if you also get some products from, it's a German company that does some organic products, food products. And so I think it's part of their CSR, or corporate social responsibility, to have some funding or grants to for small projects. And so this project is an example of a knowledge to practice project. So I put it like K2P, where if you remember earlier, there was we had first to ask the community. So Loretta is the name of one of the Indigenous community members who presided the meeting with her local organization to introduce the project, and then they agreed and together identified areas for restoration. And they also identified the flowering species and nesting trees for the giant honeybees. And this is where the indigenous and local knowledge come in. And so they were the ones who collected the wildlings, or or sort of or seedlings, and put them in a nursery to ensure survival of these seedlings that will be later on planted to grow into trees. And so the seedlings in that were planted were, so we tried to put together the results of the pollen analysis and their indigenous knowledge, or indigenous and local knowledge. And they were the ones who said, like, okay, these species are helpful to both bees, but also to our community. So that was the condition that they had, that the seedlings that were going to be planted should be helpful to both them and the bees. So mostly these were fruit trees. And a total of 6,024 wildlings were directly planted in plots with a total of 1.5 hectares in the area, so in their community area. And I think the important thing to know here is that it was essentially everything was driven by the community. So I just look for the funding, but they were the ones who discussed the modalities. So how much is a person going to be paid? Because it was like cash for work program. So they will plant a seedling, and then one will be paid per seedling. And so they all agreed on how it will be done. And therefore it is a project that they mentioned it's important. And so Loretta as the head of the community, and so they mentioned that it's part of their livelihood, and if there are more flowers there are more sources of nectar. So if you remember, that was one of the issues that had been identified earlier. So with the shifting of the temperatures, then we also get the shift in the flowering. It helps conserve the biodiversity in our community forest. And if there are no honey to be harvested, we cannot practice our cultural tradition. So now, in the informal education, adult education that we did here is to also have, or a wish actually is to also have an exchange program for the forest watch with other indigenous communities. And NTFP EP, the NGO that was mentioned earlier by Dr. Pello, where I am affiliated with, that's why it's called Non-Timber Forest Products Exchange Program, because this is what they do. So they bring different indigenous communities from different countries in Asia to learn from each other. And so I've been to several of those exchange programs focusing on giant honeybee harvesting. And it's very interesting. I think the next one, in case any of you're interested, will be in 2027. So it's every 4 years. And so we hold it in different countries. So if I remember correctly, the last one was in Vietnam. And so other honey hunters from Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, India, Philippines, etc. They will also be there. And then the one from the the last one was the one from Vietnam. And then we will all see how they will demonstrate how they harvest, for example, the giant honeybee beehives. And then the other indigenous communities will watch, but then they will also mention, like, oh, this is how we do it in our community, and maybe you can do it this way, etc. So it's a very interesting exchange that's happening. And it's not just for the giant honeybees, they do it for a lot of non-timber forest products. So whether it's a dye out of different plants, or whether it's new fiber for different types of clothing. So anything that's coming from the forest that's not from timber. So any product. So they do this different exchanges. And also mapping, GPS mapping and digital camera training in other areas, which we already did in another community, not just working on honeybees, but also different forest products. So these are just some ideas that I hope you can also learn from, and in your work, the work that you do, that you can see like the different sciences and different disciplines came together here. And nowadays my favorite analogy is from a Jesuit philosopher who mentioned that we need to jump into the water, because at the moment I feel like also myself, mostly now in as a professor, being just in confined within the four walls of a classroom, not so much going to the field anymore. So it seems like I'm someone reading a manual on how to swim. So how do I raise my arm to do a proper breaststroke, etc., but never really being in the water. And so for me, the indigenous communities, the or other local communities in the front lines, they are the ones who are really swimming. And therefore, I feel that, sure, it's important that, we read the manual, but once we have the knowledge from the manual, it's still important to jump into the water and really try to be able to apply it and learn. And so therefore, I also leave you with this quote that is often associated with Albert Einstein. So if the bee disappeared off the face of the earth, man would only have 4 years left to live. But actually, it's not true. So it's actually from a Nobel Prize winner for literature, Maurice Maeterlinck, I think is from Belgium. And so I always tell people, like, yeah, this is sort of a doomsday quote, but also take it with a grain of salt because it was, mentioned by a writer. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and thank you again for inviting me. Thank you.